I was woven from reeds that grew along a riverbank, in a land where the water gave life and death in the same breath. I did not know, in those first quiet hours of my making, that I would one day carry the most important cargo the world had never seen coming. I was only papyrus then, bent, pressed, and sealed with pitch and tar by trembling hands that worked in silence, afraid that even the sound of weaving might betray a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. I remember the woman who made me. Her fingers moved quickly but not carelessly. Every fold, every layer of tar she pressed into my sides was an act of desperate love. She was not building a boat for a voyage. She was building a hiding place for a child she could no longer hide in her own home. I did not yet know his name. I only knew that I had been made for him, and that my purpose was larger than my size. I was small enough to fit in a mother's arms, yet I was about to become the vessel that would carry the future of a nation. You may have heard fragments of this story before: a baby in a basket, a river, a princess who found him. But have you ever wondered what it might have felt like from where I floated? Have you wondered what it means to be the very thing that stood between a helpless infant and a death sentence written into royal law? I was there. I felt the water lift me. I felt the reeds bend around me. And I felt the weight of a decision no mother should ever have had to make. What happened in those next moments would shape the story of a nation still spoken of thousands of years later. But to understand why I was needed at all, you have to understand the darkness that surrounded the river I floated on, a darkness so heavy that a mother would rather trust her infant to the current of the Nile than to the hands of the empire that ruled it. That is where this story begins, not with me, but with fear and with a faith stronger than fear. To understand why I existed at all, you must first understand the world into which I was born, a world of empire, oppression, and a fear so great that a king would order the death of innocent children. By the time of this story, the descendants of Jacob, the people we now call the Israelites, had lived in Egypt for centuries. Scripture tells us they had gone there generations earlier during a famine, welcomed by a pharaoh who remembered the kindness of Joseph, a Hebrew who had risen to become second only to the king himself. But time has a way of erasing gratitude. The book of Exodus tells us plainly that eventually there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new ruler saw not history, but numbers. He saw a foreign people multiplying rapidly within his borders, and he was afraid. Historians who study ancient Egypt note that the Nile Delta region, where many scholars believe the Israelites settled, was fertile ground for both agriculture and population growth. While Scripture does not name this pharaoh specifically, historical study of the era helps us understand the political anxieties of a ruler who feared losing control over a growing labor force. The biblical text tells us Pharaoh's fear was practical and political. What if this multiplying people joined Egypt's enemies in the event of war? So Pharaoh acted, not with reason, but with cruelty. He forced the Israelites into hard labor, building store cities with mortar and brick under the desert sun. But even this was not enough to slow their growth. Scripture tells us that despite the oppression, the Israelites continued to multiply, and the fear that had settled into Pharaoh's heart grew into something far more sinister. He commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill every son born to Hebrew women. Yet these women, the text tells us, feared God more than they feared the king and refused to comply. So Pharaoh escalated his cruelty even further, issuing a chilling decree recorded in Exodus chapter 1. Every son that is born you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. This is the world into which a Hebrew woman named Jochebed gave birth to a son. This is the empire whose river I would later float upon. This is the fear that shaped the very reeds from which I was made. The Nile itself held deep significance in Egyptian life. It was more than a river. It was the lifeblood of the nation, believed by many Egyptians to be tied to the favor of their gods. Historians note that the flooding of the Nile determined the fertility of the land, the success of harvests, and the rhythm of daily existence for millions. For Pharaoh to command that Hebrew infants be thrown into this same river was more than an act of violence. It was an act of twisted irony, using the source of Egypt's life to bring death to a people he feared. It was into this river, this symbol of both abundance and terror, that a mother would eventually place her child, not by casting him in as an act of obedience to a cruel decree, but by placing him gently within a vessel of her own making, an act of quiet, desperate faith. Historians who study the daily rhythms of ancient Egyptian life note that the riverbanks were rarely empty places. Women came to wash clothing, to draw water for their households, to bathe, and to gather reeds for weaving mats, baskets, and simple household goods. The river was a place of community as much as it was a place of danger. This detail matters because it helps us understand how a basket resting quietly among the reeds might not have seemed unusual at first glance, until someone paused long enough to look inside. The ordinariness of the setting is part of what makes the story so quietly remarkable. Nothing about that morning would have seemed extraordinary to a passerby. And yet, within the ordinary, something extraordinary was unfolding. It is also worth understanding the family into whom Moses was born. Scripture identifies his parents later in the book of Exodus as Amram and Jochebed, both descendants of the tribe of Levi. This detail carries quiet significance, for it was the tribe of Levi that would later be set apart for priestly service among the Israelites. Moses was not born into distinction or comfort. He was born into a family of slaves, under the constant threat of violence, in a nation that viewed his people as a growing problem to be managed rather than a community to be honored. Nothing about his birth suggested that he would one day stand as the deliverer of an entire nation. And this, too, is part of the deeper pattern found throughout Scripture, that God often works through the humble and the overlooked to accomplish what no one could have expected. Scripture tells us in Exodus chapter 2 that Jochebed, seeing that her son was a fine child, hid him for 3 months. We are not told exactly how she managed this in a household under constant threat, but we can imagine the fear that must have accompanied every knock at the door, every cry that had to be muffled, every day that passed without discovery. The text does not dwell on speculation, but it does not need to. The weight of a mother hiding her child from a death sentence speaks for itself. When she could hide him no longer, she did not surrender him to despair. She acted, and this is where I entered the story. This is where I was made. Jochebed took reeds, the same papyrus that grew abundantly along the riverbanks of Egypt, and wove me together with care. Historians familiar with ancient Egyptian craftsmanship note that papyrus baskets were common in daily Egyptian life, used for storage, transport, and even small boats for river travel. The materials Jochebed used were not exotic or miraculous. They were ordinary, accessible, the kind of materials any Egyptian household near the river might have had on hand. But what she did with them was anything but ordinary. She sealed me with bitumen and pitch, the same waterproofing materials used on larger vessels of the time, to ensure I would not take on water. She was not simply hiding her child. She was making certain he would survive the very river that was meant to be his execution. This process was not quick, nor was it simple. Weaving papyrus into a sturdy, floatable vessel required patience and skill, layering the reeds tightly enough to hold their shape against the current, then coating them thoroughly enough that no water could seep through the seams. Every layer she pressed into place was a decision she could not undo. Once sealed, I would either hold or I would fail, and there would be no second chance to correct an error once I was set upon the water. I imagine, though Scripture does not describe her inner thoughts, that each motion of her hands carried both fear and resolve in equal measure. I felt her hands shaping me long before I understood what I was for. Each layer of reed, each careful seal, was an act of hope pressed into material form. I did not know in those hours that I was being built not as a coffin, but as an ark of deliverance, far smaller than the ark that once carried Noah through the flood, but carrying a purpose no less significant. When she was finished, she carried me to the river bank, and there, in the reeds along the edge of the Nile, she placed her son inside me. I remember that moment as clearly as anything I have ever known. I remember the warmth of a small, living body settling into the space Jochebed had shaped just for him. I remember her hands lingering, unwilling to let go, and then finally releasing me into the shallow water among the reeds. Scripture tells us she placed me among the reeds by the riverbank, not casting me into the open current, but positioning me carefully, deliberately, where I could be watched. And watched I was, not only by unseen eyes above, but by the eyes of a young girl standing at a distance. That girl was Miriam, the child's sister. Exodus tells us she stood watching from afar to see what would happen to him. I did not know her name at first, only that her eyes rarely left me. She was a silent guardian, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough away to avoid suspicion. I floated gently in that quiet stretch of water, hidden among the tall reeds, rocking softly with the current's edge. I could feel the small movements of the child inside me, the innocent unawareness of a baby who did not yet know the danger surrounding him, nor the sacrifice his mother had just made. The minutes that followed felt long, though I have no way of measuring exactly how much time passed. The morning sun climbed higher, and the sounds of the river continued around me. Birds moving through the reeds, the gentle lapping of water against my woven sides, the distant hum of a city waking to another day of ordinary business, unaware of the extraordinary event unfolding quietly at its edge. Miriam remained at her post, watching, waiting, never approaching too closely, careful not to draw attention to herself or to the basket she was guarding from a distance. I imagine her heart must have pounded with every person who walked near the riverbank, every voice that grew closer before fading away again. She had been given no instructions beyond watching. She had not been told what to do if someone found the child. She could only wait and trust that, when the moment came, she would know how to act. But that was only the beginning. It was not long before I heard voices approaching, voices of women, laughter mixed with the sounds of movement through water. I did not know then who they were, but I would soon learn that this moment would change not only my purpose, but the entire course of a nation's history. The Pharaoh's daughter had come down to the river to bathe, as Scripture tells us in Exodus chapter 2. Her attendants walked along the riverbank while she came to the water's edge. And there, among the reeds, she saw something unfamiliar, a small basket resting gently in the shallows. I felt her curiosity before I understood it. She sent her maid to retrieve me, and I remember the sensation of being lifted from the water, carried toward a woman whose position in Egypt could not have been further from the family who had made me. When she opened me and saw the child inside, Scripture tells us simply, she took pity on him. The baby was crying, and something in that cry moved her heart. She recognized immediately that this was a Hebrew child, likely aware of her own father's decree, yet compassion overtook whatever fear or obligation she may have felt toward that command. This is a moment worth pausing on, not to speculate about her private thoughts, which Scripture does not reveal, but to recognize the significance of what unfolded. A princess of the very empire responsible for this child's danger became, in that instant, the one who ensured his survival. It was not something Jochebed could have controlled or predicted. It was Providence working through circumstances far beyond human calculation. And then came Miriam, stepping forward from her hidden vantage point. Scripture tells us she approached Pharaoh's daughter and asked if she should go and call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for her. It was a bold and carefully worded question, one that opened a door without revealing the family's full connection to the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam ran to bring, though the princess did not know it, the child's own mother. Jochebed returned to the riverbank, not as a mother reclaiming her son through deception, but through the natural means Miriam had arranged. Pharaoh's daughter instructed her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." Scripture tells us plainly that the woman took the child and nursed him. I cannot describe the relief I felt in that moment, nor could I claim to fully understand the complexity of what had just occurred. A mother who had released her son into a river now held him again, not in secrecy, but under the protection of the very household that had sought to destroy children like him. Whatever fear had driven her to seal me with pitch and place her son among the reeds had, in that moment, given way to an answered hope she likely never dared to fully imagine. Yet the most important moment had not yet come. The child grew, and when he was old enough, Jochebed brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who took him as her own son. Scripture tells us she named him Moses, explaining, "Because I drew him out of the water." That name would carry meaning far beyond a single afternoon at the riverbank. It would become the name history remembers, the name of the man who would one day stand before a different Pharaoh, not as a helpless infant, but as the one commissioned to lead an enslaved people toward freedom. I did not know, as I floated among those reeds, that I carried a future deliverer. I did not know that decades later, that same infant would raise a staff over the very river that once nearly swallowed him, or that he would lead a nation through waters far larger than my small vessel could ever contain. I only knew, in that moment, that I had done what I was made to do. I had kept a child safe, if only for the length of a morning. But the story of my purpose does not end with mere survival. It carries meaning that stretches far beyond the banks of the Nile. What happened at that riverbank reveals something profound about how God works, often quietly, often through ordinary means, often through the faith and courage of people who could not see the full picture of what their obedience would accomplish. Jochebed did not know that Pharaoh's daughter would find her son. She did not know that her daughter's careful words would reunite her with the child she had released into the water. She acted in faith, not certainty. The book of Hebrews, written centuries later, reflects on this very moment, telling us that, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Faith here is not the absence of fear. It is action taken despite fear, trusting that God's purposes were larger than the danger surrounding them. This is perhaps one of the most important lessons woven into this story. Faith does not always look like certainty. Sometimes faith looks like a mother weaving reeds together with trembling hands, doing everything within her power, and then releasing what she cannot control into the current of circumstances beyond her reach. She could shape me, seal me, and place her son gently inside, but she could not control who would find him or what would happen next. That part belonged to something greater than her own effort. This story also reveals the quiet, often unseen ways that God works through ordinary people in ordinary moments. Miriam was simply a child standing at a distance, watching. Yet her presence, her willingness to step forward at exactly the right moment, became a crucial link in the chain of events. Pharaoh's daughter was simply a woman coming to bathe in the river, following a routine likely repeated many mornings before. Yet her compassion in that single instance changed the trajectory of a nation's future. None of these individuals could see the larger picture unfolding around them. Jochebed did not know she was preserving the future deliverer of Israel. Miriam did not know she was helping shape the life of the man who would one day part the Red Sea. Pharaoh's daughter certainly did not know that the child she rescued from the water would one day stand before her own family's throne, demanding freedom for an enslaved people. Each person simply responded faithfully or compassionately to the moment placed directly in front of them. This is often how God's providence unfolds, not through grand, visible miracles witnessed by entire nations, but through small acts of faith and kindness that ripple outward in ways no single person could have predicted. It calls us to consider that our own small acts of faith, courage, and compassion, however insignificant they may feel in the moment, may be part of something far larger than we can currently see. This story also speaks powerfully to the themes of mercy and unlikely deliverance. Moses was rescued not by his own people, not through some elaborate escape orchestrated by human cunning, but through the compassion of someone born into the very household that sought his destruction. This reminds us that God's mercy is not confined by the boundaries we draw between friend and enemy, insider and outsider. Deliverance in this story came from an unexpected direction, through an unexpected person, in an unexpected place. There is also something deeply moving about the image of a helpless child, placed into a vessel not of gold or grandeur, but of humble reeds sealed with pitch, being carried safely through danger. It calls to mind another vessel built long before this river scene, Noah's Ark, also sealed with pitch, also carrying life through waters that represented both judgment and preservation. Scripture does not explicitly draw this comparison, but the pattern is worth quiet reflection. Sometimes God's deliverance comes wrapped in humble, ordinary materials, entrusted to those willing to build and to release what they cannot fully control. For any believer walking through their own season of fear, uncertainty, or helplessness, this story offers a gentle but firm reminder. There are moments in life when all we can do is what Jocheb did: prepare as faithfully as we know how, place what we love into the hands of circumstances we cannot control, and trust that a greater purpose is at work even when we cannot see its outcome. Faith does not require the certainty of a happy ending. It requires the willingness to act rightly and trust that God's hand remains present, even in the currents we cannot navigate ourselves. This story also gently reminds us of the value of obedience paired with wisdom. Jocheb did not defy Pharaoh's decree through open rebellion, nor did she abandon her child to despair. She found a way, within the constraints of her circumstances, to act faithfully and courageously. Miriam did not confront Pharaoh's daughter with demands, but approached her with wisdom, offering a solution rather than a confrontation. There is a quiet lesson here about how faith often works through wisdom and careful action, not merely bold declarations. And ultimately, this story points toward redemption, not only the personal redemption of one child from death, but the beginning of a much larger redemptive story that would eventually lead an entire nation out of slavery. Moses' rescue at the river was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much greater deliverance still to come, one that would ripple through centuries of biblical history and remain central to the identity of God's people. There is also a lesson here about patience and hidden preparation. Moses was drawn from the water as an infant, but he would not stand before Pharaoh demanding freedom for his people until he was 80 years old. Decades passed between his rescue at the river and his calling at the burning bush. Scripture does not rush this timeline, and neither should we rush our understanding of how God prepares people for the purposes he has planned for them. The child pulled from the Nile spent years growing up within Pharaoh's household, later fled to the wilderness of Midian, and only then, after a long season of obscurity, was called to return to Egypt. Deliverance, both for Moses personally and for the nation he would one day lead, unfolded slowly, according to a timing that was not his own to control. This should encourage anyone who feels as though their own life is unfolding too slowly, or as though the purpose they long for seems distant and uncertain. The story of Moses reminds us that God's timing often stretches across years, even decades, and that seasons of waiting are not necessarily seasons of absence. They may instead be seasons of quiet preparation, unfolding beneath the surface long before their purpose becomes visible. It is also worth reflecting on the courage displayed by each woman in this account, Jocheb, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter alike. Scripture does not diminish their roles, nor does it treat their actions as incidental. In a culture and time when women often held limited public influence, it was the faith of a mother, the wisdom of a young girl, and the compassion of a princess that together preserved the life of the one who would become Israel's deliverer. This pattern of God working through the courage and faith of women appears throughout Scripture, and this story stands as one of its earliest and most tender examples. As I reflect on that morning by the river, I recognize now what I could not fully understand then. I was simply a vessel, humble, small, made of ordinary materials. but I carried within me a future that would shape the course of biblical history. And in many ways, this reflects how God often chooses to work, through ordinary vessels, ordinary people, and ordinary moments, transformed by faith into something far greater than their humble beginnings would suggest. I was only reeds and pitch, shaped by a mother's trembling hands. Yet within me rested the beginning of a story that would one day lead a nation out of bondage, across a parted sea, and toward a promise made generations earlier to their ancestors. I do not know what became of me after that morning. Scripture does not tell us, and I will not pretend to know what it does not reveal. Perhaps I remained among the reeds, quietly returning to the elements from which I came. Perhaps I was kept for a time, a quiet reminder of a mother's faith and a princess's mercy. What I do know is this: the purpose I served that day was never truly about me. It was about a faithful mother who trusted in something greater than her own strength, a watchful sister who acted with wisdom, and a compassionate princess whose mercy crossed the boundaries of nation and decree. If you have ever felt as though your circumstances were beyond your control, as though all you could do was prepare faithfully and release the outcome into hands greater than your own, then perhaps this story speaks to you in a way it once spoke to a frightened mother standing at the edge of the Nile. Faith does not always remove the danger surrounding us, but it can carry us, gently, through waters we could never navigate alone. The river that once threatened to take a child's life became, instead, the very place where his deliverance began. And perhaps that is the quiet, enduring truth this story leaves us with. Even in seasons of fear, even when circumstances seem set against us, there remains room for hope, for mercy, and for a faithfulness that carries us further than we could ever carry ourselves. Consider for a moment how easily this story might never have been told at all. Had Jochebed given in to despair rather than action, had Miriam grown impatient and left her post too early, had Pharaoh's daughter chosen indifference over compassion, the outcome could have been entirely different. Yet each person in their own small moment of decision chose faith, chose patience, chose mercy. None of them could see the whole story unfolding. None of them understood in that instant how their choice would echo across generations. And perhaps that is true for us as well. We rarely see the full weight of our own faithful choices in the moment we make them. We simply do what we can with what we have, trusting that it matters, even when we cannot yet see how. I was only a basket, shaped from river reeds and sealed with pitch, resting quietly among the tall grasses of the Nile. I did not part any seas. I did not perform any miracle. I simply held what I was given to hold, and I trusted the water to carry me where it needed to go. Perhaps that is enough of a lesson on its own, that faithfulness does not always require grandeur. Sometimes it simply requires holding steady, staying sealed against the water that threatens to overwhelm, and trusting the current to carry what has been placed within us toward the purpose it was always meant to reach. If this story strengthened your faith or helped you see Scripture from a fresh perspective, consider subscribing to Faith Cognition for more original Bible storytelling.